I'm going to start this video off with a quote. Henry Ford once said, "It is well enough that the people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system. For if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." I quote this because it encapsulates the fact that the contents of this video may be unsettling compared to the videos that I normally make. I still feel compelled to make this video because I've been exploring the financial world for the last 4 years, and it's definitely given me a more complete view of the world. I want to share some of what I've come across with you guys. I'm also going to do a video about cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin in the future, and to understand why Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies may continue to rise, it's critical that you understand the contents of this video. I hope that you find this topic interesting and that it inspires you to do your own research afterwards. Now, with that said, let's begin. So who controls all of our money? It's a simple question. We all know that you and I don't control it. Our employees don't control it. The companies that they work for don't control it. So who does? Where does it even come from in the first place? I'll give you a hint. Money does not come from the government. It's a seemingly obvious question that's never asked or taught in schools for some reason. Unfortunately, most people's lives are basically dedicated to money. It's all people ever worry about or talk about. We go to school to learn basically how to go to university, to learn the skills to get a good job so that we can trade hours of our lives, all for this thing called money. So why wouldn't you want to know where money comes from and who issues it? Today, in this very special video, you're about to find out the answer to the question of who controls all of our money. People today can tell something isn't quite right with our financial system, but they just can't put their finger on it. Some people think it's the failure of government, others think that it's the failure of capitalism itself. This video should clarify a few things. The year is 1694, and England had just suffered through 50 years of war. Exhausted, the English government needed loans to fund their political means. Brainchild of Scottish banker William Paterson, it was decided that a privately owned bank that could issue the money to the government out of thin air was to be the solution. This was the very first modern central banking system in the world. Central banking is more influential than laws, governments, and politicians, but strangely not the focus of the general public. Fast forward to the early 20th century, and after 2 failed attempts, a group of bankers wanted to put a central bank in the United States of America. It was December of 1910, and Senator Nelson Aldrich boarded a private train car in New York with 6 others. The 6 were not to be spotted by any news reporters to avoid questions. Their destination? Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. The meeting went for 9 days, and from that, they created the Federal Reserve System. This is all documented and a matter of public record. Some of them went on to write about the meetings in their personal biographies. Here's a quote from Frank Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank of New York, February 9th, 1935, in the Saturday Evening Post.
"I was as secretive, indeed as furtive as any conspirator. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen, or else all our time and effort would be wasted. If it were to be exposed that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress."
The 6 men that Nelson Aldrich brought together included the head of banks, branches of government such as the Treasury, and some of the richest people on earth at the time. To give you an idea of how rich they were, in 1910, these 6 men represented a quarter of the world's worth. The bankers told the American public that the purpose of the system was to stabilize the economy and to stop the grip of the Wall Street banks over America. The problem was, the guys that wrote the bill were the very same people they said they'd stop. If they succeeded, it will give a small group of men the ability to create money from nothing and loan it to the American government with interest. So why was it done in secret? Because the American people didn't want a central bank. Back then, unlike today, people knew what central banks were and understood them very well. Everywhere a central bank went, there'll be wealth inequality, wild swings between economic booms and busts, and after each bust, those at the top of society mysteriously came out richer while everyone else got poorer. Europe was the running example of this at the time. The Federal Reserve was originally drafted as the Aldrich Bill, but when it came into Congress, they recognized Senator Aldrich's name and smelt a rat. The bankers needed better cover. They decided to send 2 millionaire friends to carry the bill to quell the suspicions of Congress and renamed it the Federal Reserve Act. Next, in a textbook lesson of deceit, the bankers set out to fool the American people through disinformation. In the newspapers of the day, the bankers screamed and protested against the new Federal Reserve Bill. It would ruin the banks, they exclaimed. The average person read the protesting articles of the bankers and thought to themselves, if the bankers hate it, it must be good. And then they ended up unknowingly supporting a Trojan horse. The bankers also fooled Congress by putting clauses in the bill that limited their power, only to remove them once the bill was passed. A double head fake of the public and Congress was all it took. The bill was passed on December 23, 1913, while most of Congress was out on holiday. And with that, a small group had complete monopoly over the issuing and creation of American money. Today, the Federal Reserve is the most powerful entity in the United States, and they're not ashamed to admit it either. Here's former Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan.
What should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take. What the relationships are don't frankly matter.
In addition to this, it seems that the Fed can't even be touched by investigating parties.
So I'm asking you if your agency has, in fact, according to Bloomberg, extended $9 trillion in credit, which, by the way, works out to $30,000 for every single man, woman, and child in this country. I'd like to know, if you're not responsible for investigating that, who is?
We have responsibility for the Federal Reserve's programs and operations, audits, to conduct audits and investigations in that area. In terms of who's responsible for investigating, would you mind repeating the question one more time?
Mr. Chairman, my time is up, but I have to tell you honestly, I am shocked to find out that nobody at the Federal Reserve, including the Inspector General, is keeping track of this.
So what does all of this have to do with me, you might be asking? I don't even live in the US. Well, 2 reasons. Number 1, the central banking model from the Bank of England and the United States has now been put in all countries, and even consolidated power in parts of Europe as the European Central Bank, or ECB. This unites separate countries under one economic policy. The only places in the world that don't have central banks are North Korea, Iran, and Cuba. In 2000, this list suspiciously included Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. And number 2, since the end of World War II, the US dollar has been the reserve currency of the world. This means that all central banks hold US dollars in their reserves. In other words, all other currencies are backed by the US dollar. This directly links your country to the Federal Reserve's monetary policy in America. More on this later. When the post-World War II monetary system, called the Bretton Woods system, was created, all US dollars were backed by and exchangeable for gold. A byproduct of this was that currencies used to be very stable in relation to each other.
Before that, all the countries, the exchange rates were fixed, and year after year you could predict what prices were going to be. You could start a business elsewhere, know if you could calculate profits. Business was much easier before floating exchange rates.
Unfortunately, in 1971, due to a falling US dollar, international capital flows into gold, and the funding of the Vietnam War, President Nixon took the US dollar off the gold standard.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
Now the dollar was floating and backed by nothing, and has been ever since. Okay, so let's think a little. If the US dollar is backed by nothing, but the world's reserves are backed by the US dollar, intrinsically, since 1971, doesn't this mean that all currencies are now backed by nothing tangible, only trust in the American government? Well, this is correct. Money backed by nothing is known as fiat currency. Fiat in Latin means let it be done. In other words, the government says it is money, so it is. A consequence to having money backed by nothing is that whenever the Federal Reserve creates money, it dilutes the currency supply of all other nations because their reserves are backed by the US dollar. All countries' reserves are worth less each time money is created. In the past few years, The Federal Reserve has printed trillions of dollars, and countries like Russia and China have noticed this. As a reaction to the money printing, these countries have been selling US dollar reserves and buying gold over the same period. But wait a second. Some of you clever thinkers out there may have asked yourself, if every currency on Earth is backed by nothing, how am I able to pay for things? Well, as it turns out, the whole economic system today is running because it's backed by faith. Faith that you can exchange your unit of currency for goods or services. In a way, part of that faith comes from the fact that not many people actually know where money comes from. We're about to find that out in this video. A central bank is essentially the entity that manages a nation's money supply, and it can loan money to the government with interest. In the United States and most other countries, it works like this. When the government needs more money than they receive from taxes, they ask the Treasury Department for money. The Treasury then receives an IOU or bond from the government. The Treasury, through the banks, gives this IOU to the Federal Reserve. The Fed then writes a check for this IOU and hands it to the banks. At this exchange at the banks, money is created and it can be used to pay government bills. So hang on, where does the Fed get the money to be able to write this check? They get this money from nowhere. They literally just invent it. Here's a quote from the Boston Federal Reserve. Quote, "When you or I write a check, there must be sufficient funds in our account to cover the check. But when the Federal Reserve writes a check, there is no bank deposit on which that check is drawn. When the Federal Reserve writes a check, it is creating money." End quote. So in essence, they're writing a check and creating money from an account that has no money in it. The money the Federal Reserve creates can be used as legal tender to buy things and eventually makes its way into the real economy. If you and I did that, we'd go to jail for fraud, but they can do it because they invented the system. This is the same system used throughout the world today. Another part of this money creation happens at the commercial bank side. Every time you take out a loan to buy a house, car, or TV, banks create money out of nowhere to give you this loan, and you still have to pay interest on it. And don't just believe me when I say that. Hear it for yourself from the horse's mouth, the people running the system. Graham Towers, former governor of the Central Bank of Canada, states, quote, "Each and every time a bank makes a loan, new credit is created, new deposits, brand new money." End quote. Paul Tucker, Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, quote, "Banks extend credit by simply increasing the borrowing customer's current account." End quote. So what they're basically saying is that each time the bank makes a loan, the bank doesn't use other people's deposited money and give it to you. It creates new money. In modern times, this means typing digits into a computer. 97% of all money is digitally created like this. Only 3% is the physical cash and coins that we carry. Another crazy thing that commercial banks can do is lend out 10 times more money than they actually have in reserves. This is called fractional reserve lending. So who wrote this ridiculous system into law? For the United States, it was part of the Federal Reserve System drafted in 1913. And again, this is the same system used throughout the world. So what's the issue? Why should I even care? Well, there's consequences. When more loans are given out, more money is created, and the rest of the money in circulation is worth less and less as the years go on. This is known as inflation. In a way, inflation is basically a tax that we all pay for the fraud of money printing. Easy money now in exchange for tax on our future generations. It's also why in 1950, a house used to cost $7,000 and a car, $2,000. Obviously, this is no longer the same today. Things will always keep getting more expensive as long as this system is in place. This was actually kind of okay because wages grew in relation to inflation until about 2008. Why this stopped happening is a story for another day. So things are already pretty crazy, but they get even crazier. The more you look into it, the stranger things become. So remember how we're talking about how central banks and commercial banks can create money out of nothing? This procedure actually does create something. It creates debt. Let me explain. When you take out a loan, it's written down as an asset in the bank as a negative form, kind of like a negative value of money, or otherwise known as debt. Under this system, debt is actually money. And again, don't just listen to me. Mariner Eccles, former governor of the Federal Reserve, states, quote, "If there were no debts in our money system, there wouldn't be any money. So in essence, instead of gold being the backbone of our economy, it's now debt. The system we're under now is sometimes referred to as the debt-based monetary system. It requires that debt always grows. Countries and people must become deeper in debt so that there's more money in the system, because remember, debt is money. If people and governments stop borrowing money and pay back loans, the debt doesn't grow, the money supply shrinks, and the system falters. It truly is bizarre, but we all live in this system each and every day. The Federal Reserve and other central banks control money by adjusting its supply and how much it costs to borrow money, otherwise known as the interest rate. With these tools, and as a consequence of human group psychology, central banks can create booms and busts in the economy at will and also distort and derail an economy by messing with it. Let's take a quick case study. In the year 2000, Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan cut interest rates to 1%. He did this to try and fight off a recession from the dot-com bubble and encourage people to borrow money. When interest rates are low, if you're borrowing money, you save a whole lot on repaying mortgages. Since a 1% interest rate hadn't been seen at the time since the 1950s, it was a pretty good deal. Greenspan's idea was that he could create a wealth effect. People would start to buy houses, the prices would go up, and then people would feel wealthier and spend more money in the economy and stimulate it. Greenspan sure succeeded in getting people to borrow money to buy houses, but they borrowed too much, and the result was the 2008 housing bubble. This is a prime example of what can go wrong when central banks mess with an economy. Yes, corrupt bankers have a lot to answer for in their role in the 2008 crisis, but the Fed has a far bigger long-term impact. Even crazier things are happening in Japan. Their central bank is buying so many stocks that they were the #1 buyer of Japanese stocks in 2016. So they have part ownership of companies with money that they created from nothing. So in essence, it is the central banks that control our economy and the central and commercial banking system together that control all of our money. The difference is, central banks can create money at will, while commercial banks need loans to create money. To give you an idea of people's views of central banking when people actually knew what central banks were, here's a couple of examples. In 1881, then President of the United States, James Garfield, states, quote, "Whoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce, and when you realize that the entire system is very easily controlled one way or another by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate." End quote. Benjamin Franklin in his autobiography stated that the prime reason for the American War of Independence was a battle over who actually controlled and issued the money of the new colonies. Moving on to more modern times, Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman states, quote, "The Federal Reserve definitely caused the Great Depression by contracting the amount of currency in circulation by 1/3 from 1929 to 1933, end quote. So with all of this being said, some would argue that central banks are not inherently a bad thing. They just need to be part of the government and not privately owned. The government should be able to issue its own money for the benefit of the people and shouldn't have to pay a massive interest on its own debt. This was tried at least once in the United States by President Lincoln, who stated this,
"The government should create, issue, and circulate all the currency and credit needed to satisfy the spending power of the government and the buying power of consumers. By the adoption of these principles, the taxpayers will be saved immense sums of interest. Money will cease to be master and become the servant of humanity."
Abraham Lincoln then issued his own government money. It was called the Greenback. No further comments on that story. So I think we'll end the video there. There's so much more that I could cover about what central banking decisions led to what revolutions around the world. Pretty much when you look at it, all revolutions and all wars, when you dig through everything, it all boils down to money. I could also have talked about the new global movement of those who are rejecting the debt-based economic system. People are starting to move their currency into gold, silver and cryptocurrencies, like Bitcoin. So there is a light at the end of the tunnel, but that's a whole nother story for another day. Anyways, if you've watched the whole way through this video, congratulations. You're one of the few who have found out the hidden truths about who controls all of our money. I think I've only met about 4 people in real life that have been aware of the debt-based economic system. It's strangely unknown, but is as true as anything. I even showed you all of the quotes of the bankers and the former heads of the Federal Reserve telling you from their own mouths how the system actually works. If this is your first time of hearing all of this, I encourage you, as I said before, to do your own research, and then you'll start to see the bigger picture, and the world today will make a whole lot more sense. If you want some good starting resources, I recommend Mike Maloney's Hidden Secrets of Money series. It's here on YouTube and I'll leave a link below. Mike is a very knowledgeable guy and I've had some great long conversations with him about the economy. If you're into reading and you want to know more about the history of the Federal Reserve, I recommend the book by G. Edward Griffin, The Creature from Jekyll Island.
Hey, an alien!
Yes, I've travelled across space to check on the progress of your species.
Cool. Shall I take you to our leader?
Your what?
Our leader, the guy in charge.
The guy in charge of what?
Well, in charge of everything.
You have one guy in charge of everything?
No, he's in charge of government.
What is government?
Well, government makes the rules for us. It tells us what we can do and what we can't do.
So is government really smart? They come up with wise rules for you to follow?
Well, mostly. But some of its rules are really stupid.
Do you disregard those rules?
No, we have to follow the rules, even if they are stupid or we disagree with them. Government punishes anyone who disobeys the rules.
So you are slaves to government?
No, it's not like that at all. Government works for us, the people. It serves us. We're the boss.
It tells you what to do, and it punishes you with violence if you disobey it, and yet you're its boss?
Yeah.
But there are some things government does that you don't like.
Well, yeah, not everything government does is popular. Like spending on wars, for example.
What is a war?
It's when government basically spends the people's money on weapons and soldiers and then sends them over to the other side of the world to kill a bunch of people over there and destroy their country. I don't like it that government does this.
Well, I can see why you might not like that. Have you humans reached the stage where you generally consider stealing, enslaving, and killing each other to be bad things?
Oh yeah, we know that. Don't steal, don't attack, don't assault.
But you give money to government and they use it to kill people.
Well, yeah. But government does good things with tax money as well.
Why don't you stop paying for the things you don't like and only pay for the good things it does?
No, we can't do that. You can't just decide to stop paying taxes because the rules say that everyone has to pay taxes.
But the rules come from government though, don't they?
Yeah.
So government made a rule which says that everyone has to pay them money. So everyone pays taxes because if they didn't, government would punish them using violence?
Well, yes, but most people don't mind paying taxes. Most people feel obligated to pay taxes and obey government laws because it's for the good of society. Society needs government, and that means we all have to pay taxes.
So just to make sure I've got this straight, government makes the rules and you feel obligated to follow the rules, even the ones you don't like, and it tells you what to do and threatens to punish you if you don't do what it says, and it uses some of the money that it's taken from you using threats of violence to pay for things you don't like and actually think are immoral, like mass murder.
Yeah, but we can ask it to please tell us to do smart things, and please don't take our money and use it to kill people. We're allowed to ask them to tell us to do what we want them to tell us to do.
Are you guys just scared of this thing? Is government some huge monster that can just squish you at any moment if you disobey?
No, government isn't a monster.
Well, what is it then? Could you draw me a picture of it?
Government isn't really the sort of thing you can draw a picture of.
Maybe you could take me to it. Where is government?
You mean the building?
Government is a building.
No, but the politicians who make up the government have buildings they work from.
So government is a group of these politicians?
Yeah.
Okay, so what species are these politicians?
Well, they're human.
Like you?
Yeah.
So politicians are humans and they're government. You're a human, but you're not government.
No.
So it's the politicians, they're the ones that boss the rest of you around and make you do things you don't want to do and take your money using threats of violence. But even though you're all humans, you're not allowed to boss them around and take their money?
No, they'd put us in a cage if we did that. But look, it's not like the politicians can just do whatever they want. Like, a politician can't just come up to me on the street and make me give him money. They can't do that. Politicians can only do things like that in their job, when they're working for government.
Oh, so politicians aren't government, they just work for government?
Yeah.
Okay, so government isn't a monster, and it isn't a building, and it's not politicians, it's something else. And it employs politicians, who are just regular humans, who get to order everyone else around and take their money. How does a regular human become a politician?
Well, that's the great thing about our government. It's a democracy, and that means that the people actually have the power, because we get to decide who among us get to be the politicians. We get to vote. And if a politician starts doing things we don't like, we can just replace him with someone else at the next election.
So the people that get chosen to be politicians only get to boss people around and take their money for a short time, and then they go back to being regular humans?
Exactly.
That sounds like a powerful position to be in. But if you get to choose who does that, I assume that politicians are always the wisest, most honest, caring and respected people among you.
Well, no, not really. I wouldn't say politicians are known for being honest, or wise, or caring. And they're certainly not the most respected people among us. Come to think of it, most politicians are lying, power-hungry crooks.
The ones you chose?
Yeah, they're always doing things we don't like. They use taxpayers' money to enrich themselves and their friends, and they never keep their promises to voters. They've been caught stealing and lying and taking bribes, and they mostly do what the big corporations want. Yeah, they're always doing stuff like that. They're completely corrupt. They're a bunch of lying crooks.
But you said that most humans know that stealing and beating each other up and killing are wrong. And you said that you have the power because you can change who's in charge. So why don't you just replace the lying, thieving, murderous, crooked politicians with some regular people?
Well, we don't try to elect lying crooks. It just always turns out that way. But we have to have a government because some humans are nasty and might kill or enslave or steal. Civilization just couldn't survive without government.
Let me get this straight. Because you're worried about the small number of nasty people that are willing to kill, enslave and steal, you think it's necessary for your survival to have a system where some humans among you, for a short while, get to call themselves the government, and they get to order everyone else around like slaves and, if they want, commit mass murder overseas, using money they stole using threats of violence. Politicians get to kill, enslave and steal because if they didn't, someone else might? And you try to elect good, honest people to be politicians, but what happens every time is that the people you elect turn out to be corrupt, evil, lying crooks. That's your system.
Yeah, that's pretty much government.
Tell me more about your leaders. Who is the current leader of your species, and where are they leading you?
But we don't have just one leader for the whole planet. The world is divided into countries, and each country has a leader of its own and a government of its own.
You don't have one government that rules the whole planet?
No, this planet is really big, and there are billions of people on it. The world is divided up because people in different places want different kinds of leaders and governments.
How many countries are there?
A couple of hundred, I think.
So there are millions of people per country?
Yes, or hundreds of millions in some of them.
And all the people in a country live under one single government?
There can be layers of government, but there's only one government in each country. That's how it works.
But you can have multiple governments on the same planet?
Yes, and it's better that way. If you had a single government for the whole planet and it turned tyrannical, there'd be nowhere to escape to and no one to oppose it. And I wouldn't want to be ruled by a bunch of people living thousands of miles away on the other side of the planet. It's better having government more local, because then it's more accountable.
How far is it from here to where the rulers of this country live?
The capital of this country is hundreds of miles from here.
So you don't want to be ruled by a bunch of people living thousands of miles away, but you don't mind being ruled by a bunch of people living hundreds of miles away?
That's just how it is, I guess.
Why don't you and your neighbours set up your own country here, so you can keep a close eye on what the individuals acting as your government are doing?
I don't think our government would allow us to do that.
So you have these countries, some big and some small, and the individuals living in each country separately choose which people are going to be their politicians and act as government of that country.
Yes, although not everyone is lucky enough to live in a country where we get to choose our leaders. A lot of countries have kings or dictators or warlords running their government. People in undemocratic countries don't get to choose their leaders.
So you consider yourself lucky because you live under a democratic government, where you, along with millions of other people, get to vote, and whoever gets the highest number of votes becomes leader of the government, the gang that tells you what to do and robs you.
Yes, but there's more to it than that. Democracy isn't the only thing that's great about the government of this country. In fact, democracy itself is not an ideal system at all, everyone knows that. With a pure democracy, the majority rules, because the politicians do whatever the majority of people want them to do, and this can be a problem for minorities. We know this. The real reason why we're lucky in this country is that our government is not a pure democracy, but a republic. With a republic, minority rights are protected against the tyranny of the majority.
How?
Our rights are listed in our constitution, the document that established our government. It lays out how government is supposed to work. It says what government is allowed to do and what it isn't allowed to do.
What does it say government is allowed to do?
Government is allowed to collect taxes for things like national defence.
Hold on. The Constitution says that government is allowed to collect taxes. So it says that the individuals who are acting as government are allowed to rob everyone else using threats of violence.
Yeah, but only to do good things.
Where did the Constitution come from?
It was written by the founders of this country, the people who first set up the government.
The first politicians of the country?
Yes.
So a bunch of regular people just got together and wrote on a piece of paper that they're allowed to rob everyone else, as long as they call themselves government and call their robbery taxation. Then because they have this special piece of paper, everyone just sits back and lets these guys rob them?
You're missing the point. The founders wrote the Constitution to restrain government. They made sure there was a separation of powers, so there were checks and balances in the system. They did this to strictly limit the power, size and scope of government. They made a list of things the government can do and must do, and everything else the government can't do. They even wrote about specific things that the government can't do, like violating the inalienable rights of the people to life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness.
Okay, but I don't see why the piece of paper is so important. I mean, hypothetically, what if the majority of the people want government to do something that the Constitution says government shouldn't do? Couldn't the people vote in politicians who promise to do it for them regardless of what the Constitution says? How does having your rights listed on an old document help protect your rights today?
Well, if the politicians who get voted in want to pass unconstitutional legislation, then the third branch of government, the judicial, will step in and not let the legislation pass. The founders recognised the problem of democracy, so they gave us a Supreme Court, and their role is to check whether legislation is constitutional or not.
But the Supreme Court is itself part of the government.
Yes, politicians get voted into positions in the executive and legislative branches, but the judicial branch is made up of judges. So if a majority supports the government violating the rights of a minority, the judges of the Supreme Court simply won't let it happen.
Are these Supreme Court judges just regular humans?
Yes.
So how does a regular human become a Supreme Court judge?
They are appointed.
By who?
The politicians.
But then, what is to stop the democratically elected politicians just appointing judges who will allow their popular but unconstitutional legislation to pass?
Well, they just aren't allowed to do that.
By who?
By the Constitution.
The piece of paper?
Yes, I admit it's not a perfect system. I suppose what you're saying could happen.
Does the government of this country, which you consider yourself lucky to live under, ever do things its own constitution explicitly forbids?
Yeah, a lot of things actually. The government is a lot bigger now than it was when the Constitution was written. The politicians pay lip service to the Constitution, but they trample over our rights anyway.
What about the Supreme Court?
I guess that system hasn't worked very well lately. Government does pass unconstitutional laws all the time. The separation of powers worked for a while though, it's not a bad system.
Powers were separate? I thought you said that the powers were all in branches of the same government.
Well, yes. The branches of government are totally independent and separate from each other. Except that they're all part of the same organisation and all funded by taxation.
So when you said the system had checks and balances in it, you meant that the government would check itself and balance itself.
That was the idea.
So let me get this straight. A long time ago, a small bunch of regular humans had a meeting and created a document called a constitution that said that they can rob everyone else, millions of people, using threats of violence to make everyone obey their rules and commands. But so that the masses of the people would let them get away with this robbery and slavery, that small bunch also promised in the same document that there were some things the government would never do, and they described a way to structure government so as to restrain it. But over time, the promises have proven to be worthless, the restraints have proven to be useless, and government has grown significantly in size, power and scope, violating more and more of the rights of the people. It sounds to me that if the Constitution was written to constrain government, then it's been a complete failure.
Well, the real problem is that people just don't believe in the Constitution anymore. The Constitution only works when people know what it says and why it's important. If people just knew that, then they wouldn't vote for politicians who violate it. An informed populace, that's the only way to really restrain government.
Wait, you said you feel lucky because this country is a republic, not a democracy, and a republic has these supposed checks and balances that prevent government from violating people's rights, even when a majority wants to violate the rights of others. But now you're telling me a republic can only work if people refrain from electing politicians who will violate the rights of others in the first place. That's the same as a democracy. We're back to where we started.
I see your point.
Is there anywhere on the planet where government is, despite the imaginative labels, anything other than a gang of thieves and bullies?
But there'd be chaos without government.
I'm sure that's what they tell you.
This is a moneylender called Meyer, and this is another guy called John. They live in a brand new country called Freeland. Meyer goes to the newly formed government of Freeland and asks to establish a central bank to issue the currency of the country. The central bank will be privately owned and run. The government agrees. Now John decides he wants to build a house here in Freeland, but no money exists yet, so he goes to Meyer, the central bank, and asks for $100 Freeland to build it. Meyer gives him that $100 loan, which represents an immediate debt. That paper money basically says, you are in debt by this much. But on top of the $100, Meyer charges John a 10% interest rate which must be paid back over 10 years. That means that in total, John will have to work to pay back $158.40 over 10 years on the original principal debt of $100. The problem is, there's only $100 in circulation because that's all the Central Freeland Bank has printed. So how does John pay back $158.40 when there's only $100 in circulation? More money needs to be printed so that there's enough in circulation to cover the interest. So John goes back to the bank to ask them to print another $58.40 to loan him so that he can pay back the original debt. The bank conjures that $58.40 out of thin air and issues it to John, but at interest. They want 10% over 10 years on that money as well. So he's now in debt to the tune of $192.40. But there's only $158.40 in the system. So John goes back to ask for more to cover the shortfall again. They issue that at interest as well, and so on and so on. Under this system, there is never enough money in the system to pay off all debts. It keeps John in a perpetual state of debt to the bank. The only way he can meet his payments is if the bank issues more, which puts him further into debt. It's a spiral that grows exponentially and will eventually get out of control. John has to work harder and harder to generate more and more money without ever getting the benefit of it himself. The bank owns more and more of his labour, and more of his earnings are consumed by the repayments. Eventually John will fall into a state of exhaustion and will have to default on his loan, at which point the bank comes in and takes all his tangible assets, such as the house he has built and the land it sits on. So the bank has given out of this nothingness these pieces of paper or numbers on a computer screen that are worth nothing to John, and in return they have sucked up all his real solid, tangible assets that have intrinsic worth. They have gained riches without industry, without working for it. In the process they have also made a slave out of John, who has worked all his days trying to keep up with repayments. They have been parasites on his life. They have been getting richer in the process and leaving him with less and less. That's effectively what is happening in the world today, except the government is a middleman between the bank and John. John being us, the people. Governments borrow money from privately owned central banks who charge them interest for the privilege. The governments are then instantly in debt, and because the debt has compound interest on it, they need the central bank to issue more money to cover that interest, which they do, also at interest, and the whole thing gets into a spiral. There is never enough money in the system, and there never can be. It was designed that way, because it means that way we can never be debt-free. Never being debt-free keeps us in slavery to the banks. The government then charges their citizens more and more tax to try and keep up with the interest payments to the banks. This means the citizens have to work harder and harder with less and less personal reward. With the sweat of their brow they generate goods and services to sell, only for increasing amounts of their income to be vacuumed up in taxes and debt repayments through the system to the central bank. The citizens become impoverished and enslaved, and the central bank grows wealthier and fatter. A two-tier system is created like that proposed by Plato. Those at the top get richer and the rest get poorer. In the meantime, as the debt spirals, we need to work more, sell more, generate more, consume more. Our businesses try to find new markets, expand into new territories, consuming and destroying more and more of the Earth's resources on the way. People in the new markets might not need what we're selling, but we need to sell it to them, so we need to convince them that they need it. Consumerism and materialism spirals out of control. Adverts lie and tell us we need their thing to make us happy, and then when we buy it, they release a newer, better version a year later, and then they tell us we need that one instead. At times, the bank issues credit freely to encourage the spending spiral, and then, when they feel like it, when everyone is loaded with debt, they can contract the money supply, cause a depression in the economy which causes millions of citizens to default on home payments or car payments, all the stuff they've been buying but haven't really been able to afford, at which point the bank steps in and takes control of those hard, valuable assets, and the people are left in poverty. The endless growth that means new money has to be constantly pumped into the system also means the currency becomes increasingly worthless. This is called inflation. A couple of generations ago, one parent could go out to work and provide more than enough for a family of 5. Today, 2 parents working sometimes barely cover the cost of living. Nothing in nature indulges in endless growth like this except for cancer, and that is far from healthy. Left unchecked, it causes death to its host. Likewise, there is not a single civilization in history that based its economic system on usury that didn't collapse into an exhausted heap in the end. There is no escape from it. That will happen to us too. Our whole economic system is headed for a huge collapse, and when it does, the elite money men will step in to snap up the valuable resources and consolidate global assets in the hands of a few. This would create a global 2-tier system. What we have felt thus far are only tremors. There is something much bigger ahead.